My name is Opal Powell, and at 72 years old, I never imagined I'd be standing in a courthouse lobby, clutching a manila folder full of legal documents that would forever change my relationship with my son Marcus and his wife Cheryl. The marble floors beneath my worn orthopedic shoes felt cold and unforgiving. Much like the treatment I'd endured for the past 3 years since Cheryl had convinced Marcus to move me into their guest house. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The arthritis in my knees sends sharp reminders through my joints every morning when I rise from my narrow single bed. My fingers, once nimble enough to thread the finest needle for my quilting, now struggle with simple tasks like opening pill bottles or buttoning my cardigan. But my mind remains sharp as ever, perhaps too sharp for my own good, because it means I remember every slight, every dismissive comment, every time I was made to feel like a burden, rather than a beloved family member. The guest house sits behind Marcus and Cheryl's sprawling suburban home in Riverside Heights, connected by a winding stone pathway that becomes treacherous when wet. What Marcus had described as my private sanctuary when he moved me in felt more like exile with each passing month. The small space contains just the essentials: a kitchenette with a temperamental refrigerator, a bathroom with grab bars that Cheryl installed with theatrical fanfare about her thoughtfulness, and a living area barely large enough for my favorite armchair and the television that gets only basic channels. 3 years ago, when my husband Theodore passed after 48 years of marriage, I thought moving closer to family would bring comfort during my grief. Theodore and I had lived in our cozy ranch home in Cedar Falls for decades, where I knew every neighbor, every shortcut to the grocery store, and where Mrs. Chen next door would wave from her garden each morning. That house held memories in every corner. The kitchen where Theodore would surprise me with pancakes on Sunday mornings, the front porch where we'd sit with sweet tea watching thunderstorms roll across the plains, the bedroom where we'd whispered our dreams and fears to each other in the darkness. Marcus had been insistent after the funeral. "Mom, you can't stay in that big house all alone," he'd said, his voice carrying that tone of patient authority I'd grown to recognize. "Cheryl and I have plenty of space, and we want to take care of you." At the time, overwhelmed by grief and the daunting prospect of managing Theodore's affairs, it seemed like a blessing. I sold the house that had been our sanctuary and moved the few possessions that would fit into the guest house, storing the rest in a climate-controlled unit across town that I rarely visited anymore. The first months weren't terrible. Marcus would stop by the guest house most evenings after work, and we'd sit on the small porch talking about his job at the engineering firm, or sharing memories of Theodore. Cheryl maintained a polite distance, which I attributed to giving me space to grieve. She'd wave from the main house's kitchen window, or offer brief pleasantries when our paths crossed in the driveway. But there was always something measured about her interactions, as if she were following a script for appropriate daughter-in-law behavior. The shift happened gradually, so subtly that I didn't recognize it as deliberate at first. Marcus's visits became shorter, then less frequent. "Sorry, Mom, Cheryl has me working on the bathroom renovation." Or, "Can't tonight, we promised the Hendersons we'd join them for dinner." Soon his check-ins dwindled to quick waves as he backed out of the driveway each morning, already talking on his phone about work matters that seemed to consume more of his attention each day. Cheryl's transformation was more dramatic. The polite distance evolved into barely concealed irritation whenever I needed something from the main house. My washing machine in the Muno guest house had broken during my second month there, and when I asked about using theirs temporarily, Cheryl's smile became so tight it looked painful. "Of course, Opal. But please try to do your laundry when we're not using the machine. Our schedule is pretty busy." Her schedule seemed to involve using the washing machine at precisely the times I needed it most. The real problems began when my health started declining more noticeably. The arthritis that had been manageable with Theodore's help and my familiar home environment worsened in the dampness of the guest house. Dr. Martinez, my physician for the past 15 years, had moved his practice to the other side of town, making my monthly appointments more challenging. My driver's license had expired the previous year, and when I'd attempted the vision test for renewal, the clerk gently suggested I might want to consider alternative transportation options. When I mentioned to Marcus that I was having trouble getting to my medical appointments, his response was immediate and, I thought, generous. Don't worry about it, Mom. Cheryl doesn't work Fridays, so she can drive you. I felt a wave of gratitude mixed with relief. Having reliable transportation to see Dr. Martinez, the cardiologist for my irregular heartbeat, and the orthopedic specialist who managed my arthritis treatment, seemed like one less worry in my increasingly complicated life. The first appointment went smoothly enough. Cheryl drove me to Dr. Martinez's office in her pristine white SUV, chatting about the weather and her plans for redecorating their living room. She waited in the reception area while I saw the doctor, scrolling through her phone with practiced efficiency. The drive home was pleasant, and I thanked her profusely for her help, genuinely appreciative of what felt like the first real kindness she'd shown me since my arrival. But the second appointment revealed the true nature of Cheryl's assistance. As we pulled into the medical complex parking lot, she turned to me with that same tight smile I'd grown to recognize as a warning sign. "Opal, I need to run some errands while you're in there. The office is right there at the front entrance, so you shouldn't have any trouble finding it. I'll be back in about an hour." An hour. My appointment with the cardiologist was scheduled for 45 minutes, but medical appointments rarely stayed on schedule. I sat in Dr. Peterson's waiting room, watching the clock and feeling my anxiety spike with each passing minute. When I finally saw the doctor, I found myself rushing through my list of concerns, worried about keeping Cheryl waiting. The examination felt hurried, incomplete, and I left with more questions than answers about the medication adjustments he'd suggested. Cheryl wasn't in the parking lot when I emerged. I stood by the front entrance, shifting my weight from one aching foot to the other, watching cars come and go while trying to spot her distinctive white SUV. 20 minutes passed before she appeared, pulling up with another tight smile and a quick apology about traffic that didn't quite ring true. The pattern established itself over the following months. Each medical appointment became an exercise in anxiety and rushed care. Cheryl would drop me off with increasingly specific instructions about where to wait for pickup, often choosing locations that required me to walk farther from the medical building's entrance. "The circular drive gets so congested," she'd explain. "It's easier if you wait by the street entrance." The street entrance was a quarter-mile walk from most of the specialists' offices, a distance that left me winded and sweating despite the autumn chill. Dr. Martinez noticed my distress during my October appointment. "Mrs. Powell, are you feeling all right? You seem a bit flustered today." I wanted to explain about the walking, about having to rush through our conversation because Cheryl was waiting, about the growing sense that my medical care was becoming secondary to convenience. Instead, I smiled and assured him everything was fine, unwilling to burden my son's family with what felt like.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Complaints about their generosity. The breaking point came on a particularly bitter November morning when I had back-to-back appointments with the orthopedic specialist and a follow-up with the cardiologist. Both offices were in the same medical complex but in different buildings, requiring a walk across the parking lot that would have been manageable in good weather. But that morning brought the first ice storm of the season, coating every surface with a treacherous glaze that made each step a potential disaster. Cheryl dropped me off at the street entrance as usual, but this time her instructions carried a new edge. "Opal, I've got a hair appointment this morning that I absolutely cannot reschedule. It's taken me 3 months to get in with this stylist. You'll need to take the bus home after your appointments." She handed me a crumpled schedule and exact change for the fare. "The stop is just 2 blocks down from the medical complex. The number 12 bus runs every hour." I stared at the bus schedule, trying to process what she was telling me. I hadn't ridden public transportation in decades, and the thought of navigating unfamiliar routes with my mobility issues felt overwhelming. "Cheryl, I'm not sure I can manage the bus with my arthritis, especially in this weather. Could we maybe reschedule one of the appointments?" Her expression hardened in a way I'd never seen before. "Opal, I've been driving you around for months now, rearranging my entire schedule to accommodate your medical needs. I think you can handle taking the bus once. It's not like you're helpless." The word helpless hung in the air between us, sharp and cutting. As I watched her SUV disappear into the morning traffic, I felt something shift inside me. The cold seemed to penetrate deeper than just my skin, settling into my bones alongside a growing realization that my presence in their lives had become a burden they were no longer willing to carry gracefully. The walk to the first building took 20 minutes, each step carefully placed to avoid the icy patches that could send me tumbling. By the time I reached Dr. Williams's office, my clothes were damp with perspiration, despite the freezing temperature, and my heart was racing in a way that had nothing to do with my cardiac condition. The orthopedic appointment revealed what I'd feared. My arthritis was progressing faster than expected, and Dr. Williams recommended increasing my physical therapy sessions and adjusting my medications. Mrs. Powell, are you getting enough support at home? Managing arthritis effectively requires consistent care and assistance with daily activities. His concern was evident, but I found myself deflecting his questions, unwilling to admit that the support system I'd counted on was dissolving around me. The walk between buildings nearly proved disastrous. Halfway across the parking lot, my left foot hit a patch of black ice, and I felt myself beginning to fall. Only a desperate grab for a nearby car's side mirror prevented what could have been a serious injury. I stood there for several minutes, heart pounding and hands shaking, realizing how close I'd come to ending up in the emergency room with a broken hip or worse. Dr. Peterson's office was running behind schedule, and by the time I finished my appointment, the afternoon had grown even colder. The walk to the bus stop felt interminable, each block stretching endlessly ahead of me. The few other people waiting at the stop eyed me with a mixture of curiosity and concern as I huddled on the metal bench, probably wondering what had brought an elderly woman with obvious mobility issues to rely on public transportation in such terrible weather. The bus ride home was a humiliating maze of confusion and discomfort. I'd miscalculated the route and had to transfer twice, each time struggling to climb the high steps while other passengers waited impatiently behind me. By the time I finally reached the stop nearest to Marcus and Cheryl's neighborhood, the sun was setting, and my body was screaming with pain from the day's exertions. The final walk from the bus stop to the guest house took every ounce of strength I had left. My arthritis medication had worn off hours ago, and each step sent shooting pains through my knees and back. The grocery bag I'd optimistically brought for a quick stop near the medical complex remained empty. I'd been too exhausted and overwhelmed to attempt shopping after the ordeal of getting home. As I finally reached the guest house and collapsed into my armchair, I noticed lights on in the main house's kitchen. Through the window, I could see Marcus and Cheryl sitting at their dinner table, presumably enjoying whatever meal Cheryl had prepared, while I'd been struggling through my medical appointments and the subsequent transportation nightmare. Neither of them came to check on me that evening, despite the fact that my return after dark should have been obvious from the guest house lights. That night, as I soaked my aching joints in a hot bath and reflected on the day's events, something crystallized in my mind. This wasn't about convenience or scheduling conflicts. This was about power and control, about making me understand my place in their hierarchy. Cheryl had found a way to provide the minimum assistance required, while ensuring the experience was unpleasant enough to discourage future requests. The message was clear. My medical needs were an inconvenience to be tolerated rather than a responsibility to be embraced. The pattern continued and worsened over the following weeks. Cheryl's assistance became increasingly grudging and conditional. "I can drive you to Dr. Martinez, but you'll need to find your own way home because I have book club. I'll drop you off for physical therapy, but I can't wait around this time. You'll need to call a taxi." Each appointment became a logistical puzzle I had to solve while managing pain and fatigue. The final straw came during my pre-Christmas appointment with Dr. Peterson. I'd been experiencing chest pains and irregular heartbeats that couldn't wait for the next scheduled visit. When I called Cheryl to ask for a ride to what was clearly an urgent medical situation, her response was delivered with ice-cold precision. "Opal, I've told you before that last-minute appointments aren't my responsibility. You should have planned better. If it's really an emergency, call an ambulance. Call an ambulance. For a cardiology appointment." The suggestion was so absurd and callous that I actually laughed, a bitter sound that surprised even me. The idea that I should involve emergency services for routine medical care, rather than ask my daughter-in-law for a 20-minute drive, revealed how completely our relationship had deteriorated. I ended up taking a taxi to that appointment, paying $48 for round-trip transportation that ate into my limited monthly budget. Dr. Peterson's examination revealed that the chest pains were likely related to stress and anxiety rather than my underlying heart condition. Mrs. Powell, chronic stress can significantly impact cardiac health, especially at your age. Are you experiencing any unusual pressures or changes in your living situation? Sitting in that sterile examination room, wearing a hospital gown that made me feel vulnerable and exposed, I finally allowed myself to acknowledge what had been building for months. I was living in a situation that was damaging my health, both physically and emotionally. The stress of navigating transportation to medical appointments, the anxiety of never knowing whether I'd have reliable access to care, and the growing realization that I was viewed as a burden rather than a family member, were taking a measurable toll on my well-being. Dr. Peterson prescribed a mild anxiety medication and recommended regular follow-ups, but as I sat in the taxi on the way home, I knew that treating the symptoms wouldn't address the underlying problem. I was trapped in a living arrangement that was slowly destroying my health and dignity, dependent on people who had made it clear that my needs were secondary to their convenience. That evening, as I prepared a simple dinner in my small kitchenette, I heard voices from the main house's backyard. Marcus and Cheryl were entertaining friends. On their deck, their laughter carrying across the yard to my window. I could smell barbecue and hear the clink of glasses, sounds of a social life that continued without any thought of the elderly woman struggling alone in the guest house, just yards away. As I watched them through my window, illuminated by the warm light of their deck fixtures, I felt a profound sense of isolation that went beyond physical distance. These were supposed to be the people who cared about me, who had invited me to live on their property so they could take care of me. Instead, I'd become an inconvenient obligation, someone whose needs were met with the minimum effort required to avoid outright neglect. The next morning, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. Instead of calling Cheryl to beg for another ride to my upcoming appointment, I picked up the phone and called Thompson and Associates, the law firm that had handled Theodore's estate. My fingers shook as I dialed, not from arthritis this time, but from the weight of what I was about to set in motion. Thompson and Associates, this is Jennifer speaking. Hello, this is Opal Powell. I handled my late husband's estate with your firm last year. I need to schedule a consultation about elder care rights and housing arrangements. Of course, Mrs. Powell. Mr. Thompson has an opening Thursday afternoon at 2 o'clock. Will that work for you? Thursday afternoon. My hands grew steadier as I wrote down the appointment details. That will be perfect. And Jennifer, this is regarding potential legal action, so I'll need to discuss confidentiality and next steps. Absolutely. Mr. Thompson handles many elder law cases. He'll be able to guide you through your options. After I hung up, I sat in my armchair staring at the appointment card I'd written. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of agency returning, a feeling that I might have some control over my circumstances. The decision to seek legal counsel wasn't about revenge or anger, though both emotions were certainly present. It was about reclaiming my dignity and ensuring that my remaining years would be lived on terms that respected my humanity, rather than simply managing my existence. The irony wasn't lost on me. While Cheryl had been making me walk to medical appointments, dismissing my needs and treating my health as an inconvenience, I would indeed be walking to another appointment. But this time, I'd be walking into a lawyer's office, and the conversation would be very different from the ones I'd been having with doctors about managing pain and declining health. I spent the next few days researching elder care laws and housing rights, using the limited internet access on my old tablet to educate myself about protections for seniors in vulnerable living situations. What I discovered both horrified and empowered me. There were specific laws designed to protect elderly family members from exactly the kind of treatment I'd been enduring. Laws that defined adequate care and outlined remedies for situations where family members failed to meet their obligations. More importantly, I learned that my financial contributions to the household, I'd been paying Marcus rent for the guest house plus utilities, money that came from my Social Security and Theodore's pension, gave me certain tenant rights that I hadn't previously understood. The casual way Marcus and Cheryl had treated my living arrangement as a favor they were doing for me suddenly looked very different when viewed through the lens of landlord-tenant law. The morning of my appointment with Mr. Thompson, I dressed carefully in my best navy suit, the one I'd worn to Theodore's funeral and hadn't touched since. The weather had warmed slightly, making the walk to downtown manageable, though I allowed myself plenty of time to navigate the 6 blocks at my own pace. Each step felt purposeful rather than desperate, a marked contrast to my recent struggles to reach medical appointments. The law office occupied the 2nd floor of a renovated Victorian building in the historic district, accessible by a recently installed elevator that accommodated my mobility needs without requiring assistance. Jennifer, the receptionist who'd scheduled my appointment, greeted me with genuine warmth and offered coffee while I waited. The simple courtesy of being treated as a valued client, rather than an inconvenient obligation, brought tears to my eyes. Mr. Thompson proved to be a soft-spoken man in his 50s with extensive experience in elder law. His office walls displayed numerous certifications and awards related to advocacy for seniors, and his initial questions demonstrated both professional competence and personal compassion. "Mrs. Powell, please tell me about your current living situation and the specific issues you're facing." For the next hour, I detailed the gradual deterioration of my treatment, the transportation issues that were impacting my medical care, and the growing sense that I was being marginalized in my own family. Mr. Thompson took careful notes and asked probing questions that helped me articulate patterns of behavior I'd been experiencing but hadn't fully recognized as potentially illegal. "Mrs. Powell, based on what you're describing, there are several areas of concern from a legal perspective. First, if you're paying rent and utilities, you have tenant rights that appear to be violated by the inadequate living conditions you've described. Second, there may be issues of elder neglect if family members who've assumed responsibility for your care are failing to provide reasonable assistance with essential needs like medical transportation." He pulled out a thick folder and began showing me relevant statutes and case law. In our state, adult children who agree to provide care for elderly parents take on legal obligations, especially when the parent has relocated and given up independent housing based on promises of support. The fact that you sold your home and moved to their property based on assurances of care creates additional legal responsibilities. The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, during which Mr. Thompson outlined potential courses of action ranging from formal mediation to civil litigation. He explained that many elder neglect cases were resolved through negotiated settlements that established clear care standards and living arrangements without requiring lengthy court proceedings. The goal, he emphasized, isn't necessarily to punish your family but to ensure you receive the care and respect you deserve while protecting your rights and resources. Sometimes families don't realize they're crossing legal lines until they're confronted with the potential consequences. As our meeting concluded, Mr. Thompson provided me with a detailed action plan and a retainer agreement for his services. The fees were substantial but manageable given my financial resources, and more importantly, he offered to arrange payment plans if needed to ensure cost wouldn't prevent me from seeking justice. Walking home from the law office, I felt a transformation taking place within me. The woman who'd been struggling to reach medical appointments, begging for basic consideration from family members, and accepting treatment that diminished her dignity, was evolving into someone with legal representation, clear rights, and a plan for reclaiming control of her life. The guest house looked different when I returned that afternoon. Instead of seeing it as a charitable shelter provided by generous family members, I now recognized it as my legal residence for which I paid rent and utilities, a space where I had tenant rights and expectations of habitability. The main house, where Marcus and Cheryl lived their comfortable lives while treating me as an inconvenient obligation, would soon be subject to legal scrutiny if they continued their current behavior. That evening, I drafted a careful letter to Marcus outlining my concerns about the deteriorating care situation and requesting a family meeting to discuss long-term arrangements. The letter referenced my recent legal consultation without being threatening, simply noting that I'd been advised to document my concerns and attempt resolution through family discussion before considering other options. I hand-delivered the letter to their front door the next morning, timing my arrival to coincide with Marcus's departure for work, so Cheryl would be forced to receive it personally. Her expression as she read my formal request for a meeting was priceless, a mixture of surprise, confusion, and dawning concern that suggested she was beginning to understand that her treatment of me might have consequences beyond my quiet acceptance. The family meeting was scheduled for the following Sunday afternoon, giving everyone time to consider the issues I'd raised. As the date approached, I found myself feeling more confident and centered than I had in months. Whether the conversation resulted in genuine improvements to my care, or simply confirmed that legal action would be necessary, I was no longer powerless in the situation. For the first time since moving to the guest house, I looked forward to a family discussion where my voice would be heard and my needs would be taken seriously. The woman who'd been made to walk to medical appointments in ice storms was about to show her family exactly what she was capable of when she finally decided to walk somewhere that would give her the power to demand better treatment. The irony was perfect. Cheryl had forced me to become more independent and resourceful than I'd been in years, inadvertently giving me the strength and determination to fight for my rights. Sometimes the journey to empowerment begins with being pushed too far, and my walk to the lawyer's office had been the first step toward reclaiming my life. The Sunday afternoon meeting arrived with all the subtlety of a brewing thunderstorm. I had prepared meticulously, laying out documents on my small dining table like a general preparing for battle. Theodore's pension statements, my Social Security records, receipts for rent and utility payments, medical appointment schedules, and copies of transportation expenses I'd incurred when Cheryl's assistance became unreliable. Each piece of paper represented evidence of my legitimate place in this household, and the responsibilities my family had accepted when they convinced me to abandon my independent life in Cedar Falls. Marcus arrived first, his usual confidence replaced by visible discomfort as he knocked on my door rather than simply walking in as he'd done for months. The formal gesture felt significant, an acknowledgement that our relationship had shifted into uncharted territory. He wore his weekend clothes but carried himself with the stiff posture I recognized from his professional dealings, already defensive before our conversation had begun. "Mom, I got your letter," he said, settling into the chair across from my dining table with obvious reluctance. "I have to say, I'm pretty confused about what's going on here. Cheryl and I have been doing our best to help you, and suddenly you're talking about legal consultations and formal meetings. What's this really about?" Before I could respond, Cheryl appeared in the doorway, her expression carefully neutral in a way that immediately put me on guard. She dressed for the occasion in what I'd come to recognize as her confrontation outfit: crisp white blouse, perfectly pressed slacks, and an attitude that suggested she was prepared to treat this conversation as a minor inconvenience to be efficiently managed. "Opal," she said, her voice carrying that measured tone she used when addressing service providers or difficult customers. "Marcus told me about your concerns, and I want you to know that we're committed to working through whatever misunderstandings might have developed. Family is important to us, and we want you to feel comfortable here." The word misunderstandings hung in the air like a challenge. I took a deep breath, centering myself with the knowledge that I was no longer approaching this conversation as a supplicant hoping for their continued tolerance. The legal consultation had shifted my perspective fundamentally, transforming me from a dependent family member into a tenant with rights and a person with legitimate grievances. "Thank you both for coming," I began, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "I want to start by acknowledging that when I moved here 3 years ago, we all had good intentions. I was grieving Theodore's death and felt overwhelmed by the prospect of managing alone. You offered what seemed like a solution that would benefit everyone." Marcus nodded, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "Exactly, Mom. We wanted to help you during a difficult time. But somewhere along the way," I continued, "the arrangement changed from mutual support to something that feels more like charity with increasingly uncomfortable conditions. I'm no longer being treated as a family member who contributes to this household. I'm being managed like a problematic obligation." Cheryl's carefully neutral expression flickered with annoyance. "Opal, I think you're being a bit dramatic. We've provided you with housing, helped with transportation, and tried to include you in family activities. If there have been some scheduling conflicts with medical appointments, that's just the reality of busy lives." The dismissive tone triggered something fierce within me, a protective anger I hadn't felt since Theodore's death. "Scheduling conflicts," I repeated slowly. "Is that what you call making me take public transportation in an ice storm because your hair appointment was more important than my cardiac follow-up?" Marcus's head snapped toward his wife, surprise evident on his face. "What?" Cheryl, you didn't tell me Mom had to take the bus to her appointments. It happened once, Marcus, and it wasn't that dramatic, Cheryl replied. But I could hear defensiveness creeping into her voice. Opal needed to learn some independence anyway. She can't expect us to drop everything every time she has a doctor's appointment. Actually, I said, pulling out a folder from my prepared documents, it wasn't once. I have records here of 17 medical appointments over the past 8 months, where I was either dropped off with inadequate pickup arrangements, told to find alternative transportation, or charged taxi fees that significantly impacted my monthly budget. I spread the papers across the table, each receipt and appointment card representing a moment when I'd been forced to choose between my health needs and the inconvenience I caused my family. This appointment with Dr. Peterson cost me $48 in taxi fare because Cheryl couldn't reschedule her book club. This orthopedic visit required a 2-mile walk in freezing rain because the quote pickup location was moved to accommodate easier traffic flow. Marcus was staring at the documentation with growing alarm. Mom, why didn't you tell me about this? I had no idea Cheryl was. I thought the transportation arrangement was working fine. Because every time I tried to discuss concerns, I was told I was being difficult or ungrateful, I replied. Because asking for basic consideration was treated as unreasonable demands on people who were already doing me favors. Cheryl's composure was beginning to crack, her voice taking on a sharper edge. This is ridiculous, Opal. We opened our home to you, rearranged our lives to accommodate your needs, and now you're keeping spreadsheets like we're some kind of service providers you're monitoring for performance. Actually, I said, my own voice growing stronger, that's exactly what this situation has become. I pay rent for this guest house. I pay utilities. I contribute to household expenses when asked. But instead of being treated as a tenant with rights or a family member with dignity, I'm managed like a charity case, who should be grateful for whatever minimal assistance you're willing to provide. The legal consultation had given me vocabulary for experiences I'd struggled to articulate. Terms like tenant rights, adequate living conditions, and elder neglect carried weight that my previous emotional appeals had lacked. I could see Marcus processing these concepts, his engineering mind beginning to recognize the structural problems in our arrangement. What exactly are you saying, Mom? He asked carefully. What kind of legal consultation did you have? I met his gaze directly, drawing strength from the knowledge that I was no longer dependent on their goodwill for my future security. I consulted with Thompson and Associates about elder care law and housing rights. I learned that when adult children assume responsibility for elderly parents' care, especially after the parent has relocated based on promises of support, they take on legal obligations that go beyond casual assistance. Cheryl's face had gone pale, but her voice remained combative. Are you threatening to sue us? After everything we've done for you? I'm not threatening anything, I replied calmly. I'm simply informing you that the current arrangement is unsustainable and potentially legally problematic. My health is being negatively impacted by the stress of uncertain medical transportation and the emotional toll of feeling unwelcome in what's supposed to be my home. Marcus was quiet for several long moments, processing the implications of what I'd shared. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight I hadn't heard since Theodore's funeral. Mom, I honestly didn't realize things had gotten this bad. I thought Cheryl was helping with your appointments and you seemed to be managing okay. I've been managing, I said, because I had to. Because the alternative was admitting that the people I counted on most had stopped caring about my well-being beyond the minimum required to avoid obvious neglect. The words hung in the air like an indictment, which in many ways, they were. I watched my son grapple with the reality that his mother had been struggling while he remained obliviously focused on his own comfortable life just yards away. Cheryl, however, was not ready to accept responsibility. This is completely unfair, Opal. I have my own life, my own responsibilities. I never agreed to become a full-time caregiver. If you need that level of assistance, maybe you should consider other living arrangements. The suggestion that I should leave, delivered with such casual cruelty, crystallized everything that had been wrong with our dynamic. But instead of the hurt and panic such a statement would have triggered months earlier, I felt a surge of clarity and determination. Actually, Cheryl, that's an interesting point, I said, reaching for another folder in my prepared materials. I've been researching alternative living arrangements, and I've discovered some fascinating information about my options. I pulled out brochures for several assisted living communities in the area, along with printouts about independent senior housing and in-home care services. Sunset Manor has a beautiful apartment, available for $1,200 a month, including all utilities and transportation to medical appointments. Riverside Senior Village offers independent living with optional care services for about the same amount I'm currently paying here. Marcus was studying the brochures with evident interest, but I could see Cheryl calculating the financial implications of my departure. The rent I paid for the guest house, plus my contributions to utilities and household expenses, represented a significant portion of their monthly income. But the thing is, I continued, I don't necessarily want to leave. I moved here because I wanted to be close to family during my remaining years. What I've learned from my legal consultation is that there are ways to structure care arrangements that protect everyone's interests, while ensuring adequate support for the elderly family member. I pulled out the final document from my preparation, a template care agreement that Mr. Thompson had provided. This is a formal care contract that clearly outlines responsibilities, expectations, and protections for all parties. It addresses transportation assistance, emergency care coordination, living space standards, and financial arrangements in a way that prevents misunderstandings and ensures accountability. Marcus was reading over the contract template with growing interest. This is actually pretty comprehensive, Mom. It covers a lot of scenarios we never discussed when you moved in. Exactly, I said. We made assumptions about care responsibilities without clearly defining expectations or establishing accountability measures. The result has been a gradual erosion of my care quality and your family's resentment about obligations you never explicitly agreed to accept. Cheryl was studying the document with evident displeasure, clearly recognizing that such a formal arrangement would eliminate her ability to provide minimal assistance while claiming credit for generous support. This seems awfully complicated for a family arrangement. Are we really going to start treating each other like business partners? We're going to start treating each other with the respect and clarity that prevents resentment and ensures everyone's needs are met, I replied. Business partnerships work because they have clear expectations and accountability measures. Family relationships often fail because we assume love is enough to overcome poor communication and undefined responsibilities. The conversation continued for another hour, during which we went through the care contract section by section. Marcus proved surprisingly receptive to the formal structure, asking thoughtful questions about implementation and expressing genuine concern about aspects of my care he'd been unaware were problematic. Cheryl remained resistant, though her objections became increasingly defensive, as it became clear that her husband was taking my concerns seriously. She raised issues about privacy, scheduling flexibility, and the precedent such an arrangement might set for future family decisions. What happens when your care needs increase? She asked pointedly. Are we locked into providing more intensive assistance just because we signed a contract? Actually, I said, that's addressed in Section 4. The contract includes provisions for reassessing care needs annually and modifying the arrangement or transitioning to alternative care settings if requirements exceed what family members can reasonably provide. I could see her processing the implications, recognizing that the contract actually provided more protection for her family than the current informal arrangement. So if you need nursing home level care, we're not obligated to provide it? Correct. But neither am I obligated to accept inadequate care while paying full rent and expenses. The contract establishes minimum standards that protect my safety and dignity while respecting your family's limitations. Marcus set down the document and looked directly at me, his expression more serious than I'd seen in years. Mom, I owe you an apology. I've been so focused on my own responsibilities that I didn't realize how much the care situation had deteriorated. This contract approach makes sense, and honestly, it would have prevented a lot of problems if we'd done something like this from the beginning. I appreciate that, Marcus, I said, feeling some of the tension in my chest beginning to ease. I don't want this to be adversarial. I want us to find a way to maintain our family relationship while ensuring my remaining years are lived with dignity and appropriate care. Cheryl was quiet for several minutes, clearly struggling with the idea of formal accountability for her treatment of me. Finally, she spoke, her voice lacking its earlier defensive edge. "I suppose I haven't been very considerate about the medical transportation situation. I just felt overwhelmed by all the additional responsibilities, and I may have let that affect my attitude." It wasn't a full apology, but it was acknowledgement, which felt like progress. "I understand feeling overwhelmed," I replied. "That's exactly why clear expectations and shared responsibilities are important. This arrangement has been difficult for all of us because we never established reasonable boundaries. We agreed to take a week to review the contract template and discuss it with our respective advisors. Marcus wanted to have their family attorney review the legal implications, and I plan to work with Mr. Thompson to customize the agreement to our specific circumstances." As they prepared to leave, Marcus paused at my door, looking back with an expression that reminded me of the boy he'd been decades earlier, when he was struggling with a difficult problem. "Mom, I really am sorry. I should have been paying closer attention to how things were going for you." "We all could have handled this better," I replied. "What matters now is that we're addressing the problems before they become irreparable." After they left, I sat in my armchair feeling emotionally drained but oddly hopeful. The conversation had been difficult, but it had also been productive in ways I hadn't dared to expect. Marcus's genuine concern and willingness to consider formal structure gave me reason to believe that our relationship might be salvageable. Cheryl remained a concern, but the prospect of clear expectations and accountability measures would at least prevent her from treating my care as optional while claiming credit for generosity. Whether she could genuinely adjust her attitude remained to be seen, but the legal framework would protect me regardless of her personal feelings. That evening, I called Mr. Thompson to report on the family meeting and schedule a follow-up appointment to finalize the care contract. His response was encouraging but cautious, emphasizing the importance of ensuring any agreement was properly executed and enforceable. "Mrs. Powell, I'm pleased that your family is open to a formal arrangement, but we need to be careful about the contract terms to ensure they provide real protection, rather than just the appearance of structure," he advised. "I'll draft a customized agreement based on our discussion and your specific needs, and will include provisions for monitoring compliance and addressing violations." The week that followed was a period of cautious optimism mixed with continued vigilance. Marcus stopped by twice to discuss specific aspects of the contract, asking detailed questions about my medical needs and daily living requirements that suggested he was taking the process seriously. Cheryl maintained her distance, though I noticed she'd resumed making eye contact during our brief encounters, rather than the deliberate avoidance that had characterized recent months. Whether this represented genuine attitude change or simply awareness that her behavior was now subject to scrutiny remained unclear. I used the time to document my current living situation more thoroughly, photographing the guest house conditions that would need improvement to meet habitability standards, and researching the costs of various care services to ensure the contract terms were realistic and fair. The revised care contract that Mr. Thompson prepared was comprehensive without being punitive, establishing clear standards for medical transportation, emergency response, living space maintenance, and family communication while providing mechanisms for modification as circumstances changed. Most importantly, it included provisions for independent monitoring and dispute resolution, ensuring that future disagreements could be addressed through mediation rather than deteriorating into the kind of situation I'd recently endured. When we reconvened the following Sunday to review the final contract, the atmosphere was notably different from our previous meeting. Marcus had clearly spent time considering my perspective, and even Cheryl seemed more focused on problem-solving than defending past behavior. The contract signing itself felt ceremonial, a formal acknowledgement that our family relationship was transitioning into something more structured, but potentially more sustainable. As I watched Marcus and Cheryl add their signatures to the document, I felt a profound sense of relief mixed with determination. The woman who had been forced to walk to medical appointments in ice storms had successfully negotiated her way into a position of dignity and legal protection. Whether this represented the beginning of genuine family reconciliation or simply the establishment of civilized boundaries remained to be seen, but either outcome was preferable to the deteriorating situation I'd been enduring. That night, as I prepared for bed in my small but now legally protected home, I reflected on the transformation that had taken place over the past months. The journey from invisible family burden to empowered advocate had been painful and challenging, but it had also revealed inner strength I hadn't known I possessed. The legal papers filed in my desk drawer represented more than just protection from neglect. They represented proof that I refused to accept diminished dignity simply because I was elderly and dependent on family support. The woman who had once apologized for needing medical care was now demanding appropriate treatment as a matter of legal right. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as we all adjusted to the structured arrangement, but tonight I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: security. Security in knowing my rights were protected, my needs were legally acknowledged, and my remaining years would be lived on terms that respected my humanity rather than simply managing my existence. The irony remained perfect. Cheryl's attempts to minimize her caregiving responsibilities had ultimately resulted in formal legal obligations that were far more demanding than the informal assistance I'd originally needed. Sometimes the universe has a sense of justice that operates through consequences rather than immediate rewards. My walk to the lawyer's office had been the first step in reclaiming my life, but it was only the beginning of a longer journey toward redefining what family responsibility and elderly care could look like when approached with honesty, structure, and mutual respect. The weeks following the contract signing brought changes I hadn't anticipated, both positive and challenging in ways that tested my newfound confidence. Marcus threw himself into implementing the care agreement with an enthusiasm that bordered on overcompensation, checking on me twice daily, and asking detailed questions about my comfort and needs that sometimes felt overwhelming after months of benign neglect. "Mom, how's the water pressure in your shower?" "The contract says we need to maintain adequate facilities, and I want to make sure everything meets the standards we agreed on," he said during one of his morning visits, notepad in hand as he methodically worked through a checklist he'd apparently created. His sudden attentiveness, while appreciated, carried an undertone of guilt that made our interactions feel stilted and formal. The easy relationship we'd once shared had been replaced by careful courtesy, as if we were both learning to navigate a friendship between strangers who happened to share decades of history. Cheryl's adjustment proved more complex and revealing. The contract's transportation requirements meant she could no longer casually cancel or reschedule my medical appointments based on her convenience. The first test came just 2 weeks after signing, when I had a routine appointment with Dr. Martinez that coincided with her usual yoga class. I watched from my window as she sat in her car in the driveway for several minutes before our scheduled departure time, clearly wrestling with obligations she'd never taken seriously before. When she finally appeared at my door, her smile was tight but present, a performance of compliance that felt more genuine than her previous dismissive attitudes. "Ready for your appointment, Opal?" she asked, her voice carrying forced cheerfulness that at least acknowledged my worth as a person requiring respectful treatment. The drive to Dr. Martinez's office revealed the effort she was making to fulfill her contracted responsibilities. She asked about my medical concerns for the visit, inquired whether I needed assistance with mobility, and confirmed pickup arrangements with specific times and locations, rather than the vague assurances that had characterized our previous interactions. During my examination, Dr. Martinez commented on my improved demeanor and reduced anxiety levels. "Mrs. Powell, you seem much more relaxed today. Are things going better with your living arrangements?" "Yes, they are," I replied, realizing the truth of the statement as I spoke it. "I've established clearer expectations with my family about care responsibilities, and it's reduced a lot of uncertainty and stress." "Excellent." Chronic stress can significantly impact health outcomes for seniors, so whatever changes you've made are already showing positive effects on your overall well-being. The validation from my physician felt profound. The formal care arrangement wasn't just protecting my legal rights, it was measurably improving my health by eliminating the anxiety and uncertainty that had been undermining my medical treatment for months. When Cheryl picked me up precisely at the agreed time, I found myself genuinely grateful rather than simply relieved. "Thank you for the reliable transportation," I said as we pulled away from the medical complex. "Having consistent support for my appointments makes a significant difference in my care quality." She glanced at me in the rearview mirror, and for a moment her expression softened beyond mere compliance. "I hadn't really thought about how stressful it must have been when you couldn't count on getting to your appointments," she admitted. "I was so focused on my own schedule that I didn't consider what uncertainty was doing to your health." It wasn't a complete transformation, but it represented acknowledgement I'd never received before. The legal framework was creating space for empathy that hadn't existed when our interactions were based on informal expectations and unspoken resentments. The first monthly review meeting specified in our contract took place 6 weeks after signing, with Mr. Thompson present as an independent mediator to ensure the process remained objective and productive. We gathered in Marcus and Cheryl's living room, the formal setting emphasizing that this was a business meeting rather than a casual family discussion. Mr. Thompson began by reviewing compliance with the major contract provisions, checking off transportation assistance, living space maintenance, emergency communication protocols, and financial arrangements. His methodical approach created accountability that had been impossible under our previous informal arrangement. "Mrs. Powell, how would you rate the transportation assistance you've received since our contract went into effect?" he asked, consulting his notes from our private preparation meeting. "Significantly improved," I replied honestly. "I've had 4 medical appointments, and transportation has been reliable and timely for all of them. The advanced scheduling and confirmation procedures have eliminated the uncertainty that was causing me considerable stress." Marcus nodded with visible relief, while Cheryl maintained her newly professional demeanor. The formal review process was clearly working for all of us, providing structure that prevented misunderstandings and accountability that ensured follow-through. "Are there any areas where you feel the current arrangements could be improved?" Mr. Thompson continued. I had prepared for this question, recognizing that the review process was an opportunity to address emerging issues before they became major problems. "The emergency communication protocol needs some refinement. When I had chest pains last week, it took over an hour to reach Marcus, and Cheryl was at work without reliable phone access. This hadn't been a crisis, but it had highlighted potential gaps in our emergency planning that could become serious if left unaddressed. The beauty of the formal contract was that such issues could be discussed as implementation problems rather than personal failures." "We can definitely improve that," Marcus said immediately. "What if we set up a backup communication system with multiple contact methods, and maybe identify a neighbor who could provide immediate assistance if needed?" The conversation continued for over an hour, with all parties contributing ideas for strengthening the care arrangement. Having Mr. Thompson facilitate the discussion kept us focused on practical solutions rather than emotional grievances, creating a collaborative atmosphere I hadn't experienced since moving to the guest house. By the end of the meeting, we had agreed to several modifications: enhanced emergency communication procedures, a backup transportation plan for situations when Cheryl wasn't available, and improved coordination with my medical providers to streamline appointment scheduling. Most importantly, the review process had demonstrated that our formal arrangement was working. The contract hadn't eliminated all tensions or created perfect harmony, but it had established functional processes for addressing problems and ensuring my care needs were met consistently. As spring arrived, I found myself settling into a routine that felt sustainable rather than precarious. My medical appointments were managed efficiently, my living space was maintained to agreed standards, and my interactions with Marcus and Cheryl had developed a respectful professionalism that, while different from the warm family relationships I'd once hoped for, provided security and dignity. The transformation wasn't complete or perfect, but it was real. The woman who had been forced to take public transportation in ice storms now had reliable medical care and legal protection. The family member who had been treated as an inconvenient obligation was now recognized as a person with legitimate rights and needs. During one of our regular evening conversations, Marcus reflected on the changes our formal arrangement had brought to all our lives. "Mom, I have to admit that I was resistant to the whole contract idea at first. It felt like we were treating family like a business transaction. But now?" I prompted, curious about his evolving perspective. "Now I realize that the business structure actually protects our family relationship. When expectations are clear and responsibilities are defined, there's less resentment and misunderstanding. I know what I need to do to fulfill my obligations, and you know what support you can count on." His insight reflected my own growing appreciation for the formal framework we'd established. Love and good intentions weren't sufficient to sustain healthy family relationships when care responsibilities were involved. Structure, accountability, and clear communication were essential elements that had been missing from our original arrangement. Cheryl's evolution was more gradual but equally significant. The woman who had once dismissed my medical needs as inconvenient interruptions to her schedule began asking thoughtful questions about my health and expressing genuine concern about my well-being. The transformation felt authentic rather than performed, suggesting that the structured expectations had created space for empathy to develop. "Opal, I've been thinking about your arthritis management," she said during one of our transportation sessions. "My aunt has similar issues, and she's had good results with a water aerobics program at the community center. Would you be interested in exploring that as an addition to your current treatment?" The suggestion was both practical and considerate, representing the kind of proactive care support I'd hoped for when I first moved to their property. More importantly, it demonstrated that she was beginning to see my health as something she could actively support, rather than simply accommodate when legally required. The summer months brought new challenges as my arthritis flared in the heat and humidity, requiring additional medical appointments and physical therapy sessions. But instead of the stress and uncertainty that had characterized previous health crises, the formal care arrangement provided a framework for addressing increased needs systematically. Marcus arranged for a consultation with an occupational therapist to assess my living space for improvements that could support my mobility and independence. Cheryl researched transportation options for the additional therapy sessions and coordinated with my insurance provider to understand coverage options. The collaborative approach to managing my health challenges felt revelatory after months of feeling like my medical needs were burdens to be minimized rather than problems to be solved. The care contract had created accountability that translated into genuine support rather than grudging compliance. My relationship with Mr. Thompson evolved from crisis management to ongoing advocacy, with quarterly check-ins to review the care arrangement and address any emerging issues. His continued involvement provided security and professional guidance that helped prevent small problems from becoming major conflicts. "Mrs. Powell, I'm impressed by how well your family has adapted to the formal care structure," he observed during one of our review meetings. "Many families struggle with the transition from informal to contractual arrangements, but your situation demonstrates how structure can actually strengthen rather than diminish family relationships." His professional validation felt significant, confirming that our approach was not only protecting my rights but creating a model for sustainable elder care that respected everyone's needs and limitations. As autumn approached, marking nearly a year since my transportation crisis had prompted legal action, I found myself reflecting on the profound changes that had occurred in my life and relationships. The guest house that had once felt like exile now felt like a secure home where my rights were respected and my needs were met. The family relationships that had been deteriorating under the weight of undefined expectations and unmet needs had stabilized into something more functional and sustainable. While different from the warm, informal connections I'd once enjoyed, the structured approach provided reliability and dignity that had been missing from our previous interactions. Most importantly, I had reclaimed agency in my own life. The passive acceptance of inadequate treatment had been replaced by active advocacy for my rights and needs. The legal framework provided security, but my willingness to use it when necessary had transformed me from a dependent family member into an empowered individual who demanded appropriate treatment. The irony of the situation continued to amuse me. Cheryl's attempts to minimize her caregiving responsibilities had resulted in formal legal obligations that were far more comprehensive than the informal assistance I'd originally needed. Her efforts to avoid inconvenience had ultimately created structure that ensured consistent, accountable care. But beyond the immediate improvements in my daily life, the experience had taught me valuable lessons about aging, family dynamics, and the importance of legal protection for vulnerable individuals. The assumption that family love would naturally translate into appropriate care had proven dangerously naive. Formal agreements and legal accountability were essential safeguards that protected both caregivers and care recipients from the resentments and misunderstandings that could destroy relationships. As I prepared for my weekly appointment with Dr. Martinez, I felt a sense of anticipation rather than anxiety. The reliable transportation, consistent scheduling, and respectful treatment had transformed medical care from a source of stress into a routine aspect of maintaining my health and independence. Cheryl arrived precisely on time, as had become her pattern under the formal arrangement. Her greeting was warm without being forced, professional without being cold. The relationship we'd developed wasn't the familial closeness I'd once hoped for, but it was respectful and functional in ways that felt sustainable. "How are you feeling today, Opal?" she asked as we drove toward the medical complex. "Any concerns you want to discuss with Dr. Martinez?" The question demonstrated genuine interest in my health, rather than mere compliance with transportation obligations. Whether this represented authentic personal growth or simply habit formed through consistent practice mattered less than the fact that I was receiving considerate treatment. "I'm doing well," I replied honestly. "The structured care arrangement has reduced my stress levels significantly, and I think that's having positive effects on my overall health." "I'm glad to hear that," she said, and her tone suggested she meant it. I have to admit, the contract seemed cold and impersonal at first, but it's actually made things clearer and easier for all of us. Her acknowledgement felt like vindication of the difficult path I'd chosen to reclaim my dignity and secure appropriate care. The legal consultation that had seemed like a desperate measure had ultimately created positive outcomes for everyone involved. As we pulled into the medical complex parking lot, I felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this point. The woman who had been forced to walk to medical appointments in dangerous weather now had reliable, respectful transportation. The family member who had been treated as an inconvenient obligation was now recognized as a person with legitimate rights and needs. The transformation hadn't been easy or comfortable, but it had been necessary. Sometimes the path to dignity requires formal structures and legal protections, rather than simply hoping for kindness and understanding. Sometimes walking to a lawyer's office is the most important journey an elderly person can make. The appointment with Dr. Martinez went smoothly, with adequate time for discussion and no anxiety about uncertain transportation arrangements. My blood pressure was lower than it had been in months, my stress markers had improved, and my overall health indicators reflected the positive impact of stable, respectful care. "Mrs. Powell, whatever changes you've made in your living situation are clearly benefiting your health," Dr. Martinez observed. "Your improvement over the past year has been remarkable." As Cheryl drove me home, I reflected on the doctor's words and their deeper significance. The formal care arrangement hadn't just protected my legal rights. It had measurably improved my health and quality of life. The structure that had initially seemed cold and businesslike had created space for genuine care and respect to develop. The guest house looked welcoming as we pulled into the driveway, no longer a place of exile but a secure home where my rights were protected and my needs were met. The main house, where Marcus and Cheryl lived their comfortable lives, was no longer a symbol of family relationships I was excluded from, but simply another dwelling in a complex where multiple generations coexisted respectfully. That evening, as I prepared dinner in my small but well-maintained kitchenette, I felt a deep sense of accomplishment and peace. The journey from vulnerable dependent to empowered advocate had been challenging and sometimes painful, but it had ultimately created outcomes that benefited everyone involved. The legal papers filed in my desk drawer represented more than just protection from neglect. They represented proof that dignity and appropriate care were rights rather than privileges dependent on family goodwill. The woman who had once apologized for needing medical transportation now expected reliable assistance as a matter of contractual obligation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as we continued navigating the structured care arrangement, but tonight I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Security in knowing my rights were protected, my needs were legally acknowledged, and my remaining years would be lived on terms that respected my humanity rather than simply managing my existence. The irony remained perfect and instructive. Cheryl's attempts to minimize her caregiving responsibilities had ultimately resulted in formal legal obligations that ensured better care than I'd originally needed. Sometimes the universe operates through consequences rather than immediate justice, teaching important lessons about respect, responsibility, and the legal protections necessary to safeguard vulnerable individuals. My walk to the lawyer's office had been the first step in a longer journey toward redefining what family responsibility and elderly care could look like when approached with honesty, structure, and mutual respect. The destination had proven worth every difficult step of the path. 2 years had passed since that pivotal winter morning when I'd made the decision to seek legal counsel rather than continue accepting deteriorating treatment from my family. The anniversary found me sitting in my comfortable armchair, no longer the battered piece of furniture I'd salvaged from my old house, but a new ergonomic recliner that Marcus had purchased as part of the living space improvements outlined in our care contract. The transformation of my physical surroundings mirrored the profound changes in my circumstances and relationships. The guest house bore little resemblance to the sparse, barely adequate space I'd inhabited during those difficult months. Fresh paint and warm sage green had replaced the dingy beige walls. New flooring eliminated the creaky boards that had announced my every movement. A modernized bathroom with enhanced safety features and improved lighting made daily routines easier and safer. The kitchenette had been updated with energy-efficient appliances and better storage solutions that accommodated my arthritis limitations. These improvements weren't charitable gifts or guilt-motivated gestures, but contractual obligations that had been negotiated, documented, and implemented systematically. The formal approach had eliminated the awkwardness of requesting help and the resentment that often accompanied reluctant assistance. Instead, maintenance and improvements occurred on schedule as part of our agreed arrangement. The most significant transformation, however, was in my relationship with medical care and transportation. What had once been a source of anxiety and humiliation had become a routine aspect of maintaining my health and independence. Cheryl's assistance had evolved from grudging compliance to competent support, demonstrating how structure and accountability could create space for genuine care to develop. That morning brought a perfect example of how our system now functioned. I had a quarterly cardiology appointment with Dr. Peterson, followed by blood work at the hospital lab. Under the old informal arrangement, such a complex medical day would have required multiple negotiations, uncertain timing, and considerable stress about transportation logistics. Instead, Cheryl appeared at my door 15 minutes before our scheduled departure, carrying a small cooler with ice packs for any medications that might need temperature control, and a folder containing my insurance cards, medication list, and appointment confirmations. Her preparation demonstrated the kind of thoughtful support I'd hoped for when I first moved to their property. "Good morning, Opal," she said, her demeanor professional but warm. "Are you ready for your appointments? I've checked traffic patterns, and we should arrive with time to spare even if we encounter delays." The attention to detail reflected how seriously she now took her transportation responsibilities. The woman who had once made me walk to medical appointments in ice storms had become someone who researched optimal routes and planned for contingencies. Whether this transformation represented genuine personal growth or simply the effects of consistent expectations mattered less than the reliable support it provided. The drive to the medical complex passed pleasantly, with Cheryl asking informed questions about my recent health status and sharing updates about improvements she was considering for the guesthouse ventilation system. Our conversation felt natural rather than forced, suggesting that respect and routine had created space for authentic relationship to develop. Dr. Peterson's examination revealed continued improvement in my cardiovascular health, with stress markers remaining significantly lower than they'd been during the crisis period that had prompted my legal action. "Mrs. Powell, your overall health trajectory continues to be positive. The stable living situation and reduced anxiety levels are clearly benefiting your cardiac function." The medical validation felt profound every time I received it. The formal care arrangement hadn't just protected my legal rights. It had measurably improved my health outcomes by eliminating the chronic stress that had been undermining my well-being for months. During the blood work appointment, Cheryl demonstrated the kind of advocacy support that had been missing from our previous interactions. When the technician seemed rushed and dismissive, she intervened diplomatically but firmly to ensure I received adequate attention and explanation of the procedures. "Excuse me," she said to the lab technician, "Mrs. Powell has some concerns about her blood-thinning medication and how it might affect today's draw. Could you please take a moment to address those before we proceed?" The intervention was both necessary and appreciated, demonstrating that her support extended beyond mere transportation to genuine advocacy for my medical needs. The woman who had once treated my health concerns as inconvenient interruptions was now actively protecting my interests in healthcare settings. The drive home provided an opportunity for reflection on how our relationship had evolved. "Cheryl," I said as we pulled into the driveway, "I want you to know how much I appreciate the thoughtful support you've been providing. The contrast with how things were 2 years ago is remarkable." She was quiet for a moment before responding, her voice carrying genuine emotion. "Opal, I owe you an apology that's long overdue. I was so focused on protecting my own schedule and convenience that I lost sight of your humanity and dignity. The legal action forced me to confront behavior I'm not proud of." The acknowledgement felt significant, representing accountability and growth that might never have occurred without the crisis that had prompted our formal arrangements. Sometimes relationships needed to be restructured before they could heal, and the legal framework had provided a foundation for genuine improvement. I appreciate that acknowledgement, I replied. But what matters most is how we've learned to work together respectfully. The structure has created space for both of us to succeed in our roles. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor that highlighted how much my circumstances had changed. Carol Benson, my neighbor from Cedar Falls, had driven down to visit and see how I was adjusting to my new living situation. Her presence provided an external perspective on the transformation that had occurred in my life. "Opal, you look wonderful," she said as we sat in my renovated living area, sipping tea from my good china that was now easily accessible in the improved kitchen storage. "You seem more confident and settled than when I last saw you." "I feel more secure," I replied honestly. "It took some difficult conversations and legal intervention, but I've established a living arrangement that respects my needs and dignity while providing the support I require as I age." Carol listened with fascination as I described the formal care contract and its impact on family dynamics. Her questions helped me articulate the lessons I'd learned about aging, family relationships, and the importance of legal protection for vulnerable individuals. "So the contract actually improved your relationships rather than damaging them?" she asked, clearly intrigued by the concept. "It created a foundation for healthier relationships by eliminating ambiguity and resentment," I explained. "When expectations are clear and accountability is built in, everyone knows what's required and what they can count on. It prevents the kind of deterioration that was destroying our family connections." Her visit reminded me how isolated I'd felt during the crisis period, when my world had shrunk to the confines of the guest house and the stress of uncertain medical care. Now I felt confident, inviting friends to visit, knowing that my living space was welcoming and my support system was reliable. That evening, Marcus stopped by for one of our regular check-ins, a practice that had evolved from guilt-motivated overcompensation to genuine family connection. His approach to our relationship had matured significantly since the implementation of our formal arrangement. "Mom, how did your appointments go today?" he asked, settling into the chair across from mine with the comfortable familiarity that had been missing during the worst period of our relationship. "Very well," I replied, sharing Dr. Peterson's positive assessment and describing Cheryl's excellent support throughout the day. "The structured approach to medical care is working exactly as we hoped it would." Marcus nodded with evident satisfaction. I have to admit, I was skeptical about the contract approach initially. It felt like we were treating family relationships like business transactions. But I've come to appreciate how the structure actually protects our emotional connections by removing ambiguity and resentment. His insight reflected the maturity he'd developed through our challenging but ultimately productive process of redefining our relationship. The crisis had forced all of us to examine our assumptions about family obligations and develop more sustainable approaches to elder care. "Speaking of the contract," he continued, "I've been thinking about some additional improvements we could discuss at next month's review meeting. The guesthouse HVAC system is aging, and I'd like to upgrade it before next winter. Also, I've researched some technology solutions that could enhance the emergency communication protocols." His proactive approach to maintaining and improving our arrangement demonstrated how the formal structure had evolved from crisis management to ongoing relationship stewardship. Instead of reacting to problems after they developed, we now anticipated needs and addressed them systematically. The following week brought the quarterly review meeting with Mr. Thompson, a process that had become routine but remained valuable for ensuring our arrangement continued meeting everyone's needs effectively. These sessions provided accountability and professional guidance that prevented small issues from becoming major conflicts. "Mrs. Powell, how would you assess the current state of your care arrangement?" Mr. Thompson asked, consulting his notes from our private preparation session. "Excellent," I replied without hesitation. "All aspects of the contract are being fulfilled consistently, and the quality of support has improved significantly since our last review. The transportation assistance is reliable and considerate, the living space maintenance exceeds the contracted standards, and family communication has become respectful and productive." Marcus and Cheryl both looked pleased by my assessment, their satisfaction evident in their relaxed postures and genuine smiles. The adversarial atmosphere that had characterized our early meetings had been replaced by collaborative problem-solving and mutual respect. Are there any areas where modifications or improvements might be beneficial? Mr. Thompson continued. We spent the next hour discussing potential enhancements, technology upgrades for better emergency communication, seasonal maintenance schedules for the guest house systems, in coordination with additional healthcare providers as my needs evolved. The conversation was productive and forward-thinking, focusing on continuous improvement rather than damage control. Most significantly, we addressed the long-term planning provisions of our contract, discussing scenarios for increased care needs and potential transitions to higher levels of support if my health declined substantially. These conversations were challenging but necessary, ensuring that future decisions would be made proactively rather than in crisis situations. I want to be clear that I'm not planning to need nursing home care anytime soon, I said during this discussion. But I appreciate having frameworks in place for making those decisions if circumstances change. It removes the emotional pressure from what should be practical assessments. Cheryl's response revealed how much her perspective had matured. We want you to feel secure about the future while remaining as independent as possible for as long as possible. Having clear criteria and processes for evaluating care needs protects everyone from making decisions based on fear or guilt rather than realistic assessment. Her thoughtful approach to long-term planning demonstrated genuine concern for my well-being rather than mere compliance with contractual obligations. The structure had created space for authentic care relationships to develop, proving that formal agreements could enhance rather than diminish family connections. The meeting concluded with unanimous agreement to extend our current arrangement for another year with minor modifications to address the issues we'd identified. The stability and success of our structured approach had exceeded everyone's expectations, creating a model that could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining core protections and standards. Spring brought new energy and opportunities for expanding my independence within the security of our formal arrangement. Cheryl's suggestion about water aerobics had led to my enrollment in a senior fitness program at the community center, with transportation coordination included in our care planning. The regular exercise was improving my arthritis management and providing social connections that enriched my daily life. The program introduced me to other seniors who were navigating their own family care arrangements, some successfully and others with considerable struggle. My experience with formal contracting had made me something of an informal advisor for friends dealing with similar challenges to what I'd faced. Opal, how did you convince your family to sign a legal agreement? Asked Margaret, a woman whose daughter was providing inconsistent assistance while claiming credit for generous support. My situation sounds very similar to what you described, but I don't know how to approach the topic without seeming ungrateful. Start by documenting your current situation and researching your legal rights, I advised. Then consult with an elder law attorney to understand your options. The key is approaching it as protecting everyone's interests rather than punishing anyone for past problems. Sharing my experience with others helped me appreciate how fortunate I was to have family members who, despite initial resistance, had ultimately been willing to engage with formal structures and accountability measures. Many seniors faced much more entrenched opposition to reasonable care standards. These conversations also reinforced my understanding of how unique and valuable our arrangement had become. The combination of clear expectations, legal protection, and genuine family engagement had created a sustainable model that was working for everyone involved. Summer brought a milestone that highlighted the progress we'd made: my 74th birthday celebration. Unlike the lonely Easter dinner that had catalyzed my decision to seek legal counsel, this gathering reflected the healthy relationships we'd developed through structure and mutual respect. Marcus and Cheryl organized a small party in their backyard, inviting neighbors and friends from my fitness program along with family members. The celebration felt genuine rather than obligatory, with thoughtful attention to my preferences and comfort needs. Mom, I wanted to tell you how proud I am of the courage you showed in demanding better treatment from us, Marcus said during his toast. You taught us important lessons about respect, dignity, and the structures needed to sustain healthy family relationships as we all age. His public acknowledgement felt profound, representing full recognition of the journey we'd traveled together from crisis to stability. The applause from our guests suggested that others appreciated the lessons our experience offered about navigating family care challenges. Cheryl's contribution to the celebration was equally meaningful. She had researched my favorite desserts from childhood and spent days preparing an elaborate spread that demonstrated genuine care and attention to my preferences. The effort represented the kind of thoughtful support I'd hoped for when I first moved to their property. "Opal, thank you for teaching me that love isn't enough without respect and structure," she said during her own remarks. "You showed me the difference between helping someone and actually caring for them properly." The birthday celebration became a public affirmation of our successful transformation from dysfunctional family dynamics to structured cooperation and mutual respect. The guests, many of whom were dealing with their own aging and care challenges, asked thoughtful questions about our contract approach and its practical implementation. As autumn returned, marking 3 years since my transportation crisis had prompted legal action, I reflected on the comprehensive transformation that had occurred in every aspect of my life. The woman who had been forced to walk to medical appointments in dangerous weather now had reliable, respectful support. The family member who had been treated as an inconvenient obligation was now recognized as a person with legitimate rights and valued contributions. The guest house had evolved from exile to sanctuary, a space where my independence was supported rather than undermined. The family relationships that had been deteriorating under undefined expectations and unmet needs had stabilized into something more functional and sustainable than what we'd had before the crisis. Most importantly, I had discovered inner strength and advocacy skills I hadn't known I possessed. The passive acceptance of inadequate treatment had been replaced by active engagement in protecting my rights and ensuring my needs were met appropriately. The legal framework that had initially seemed cold and adversarial had proven to be the foundation for genuine care and respect. Structure and accountability had created space for authentic relationships to develop, demonstrating that formal agreements could enhance rather than diminish family connections. Dr. Martinez's annual physical that month provided medical confirmation of the positive changes in my life. "Mrs. Powell, your health indicators continue to show improvement across all categories. Whatever changes you've made in your living situation are clearly benefiting your overall well-being." The consistent medical validation reinforced my confidence in the path I'd chosen. The decision to seek legal counsel and demand appropriate treatment hadn't just protected my dignity, it had measurably improved my health outcomes and quality of life. As winter approached, bringing memories of the ice storm that had marked the lowest point in my family relationships, I felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought me to my current circumstances. The challenging path through legal intervention and relationship restructuring had ultimately created outcomes that benefited everyone involved. The guest house was warm and welcoming, equipped with efficient heating and emergency backup systems that ensured my comfort and safety during severe weather. The transportation arrangements were reliable and comprehensive, eliminating the anxiety and uncertainty that had characterized my medical care during the crisis period. Most significantly, the family relationships had matured into something more honest and sustainable than what we'd had before. The crisis had forced all of us to examine our assumptions about care obligations and develop approaches based on mutual respect rather than undefined expectations. On a particularly cold December morning, exactly 3 years after the ice storm that had prompted my walk to the lawyer's office, I received a phone call that crystallized how completely our situation had been transformed. "Mrs. Powell, this is Jennifer from Dr. Peterson's office," the caller said. "We need to reschedule your appointment next week due to the doctor's emergency surgery. Would Thursday at the same time work instead?" "Let me check with my transportation coordinator and call you back," I replied, using language that reflected the professional standards we'd established for managing my care. I called Cheryl, who checked her schedule and confirmed the alternative appointment time without hesitation or complaint. The smooth coordination of the schedule change demonstrated how routine and reliable our system had become. "No problem, Opal," she said. "I'll update my calendar and send you a confirmation email with the new appointment details. Do you need me to contact the pharmacy about any prescription refills while we're out?" The considerate attention to related needs represented the kind of comprehensive support I'd hoped for when I first moved to their property. The woman who had once made me take public transportation in dangerous weather was now providing proactive healthcare coordination that exceeded our contractual requirements. That afternoon, as I sat in my comfortable chair watching snow begin to fall outside my window, I reflected on the profound transformation that had occurred in my life and relationships. The decision to seek legal protection rather than continue accepting inadequate treatment had been difficult and frightening, but it had ultimately created positive outcomes that none of us could have anticipated. The irony remained perfect and instructive. Cheryl's attempts to minimize her caregiving responsibilities had resulted in formal legal obligations that ensured better care than I'd originally needed. Marcus's initial resistance to structure had led to appreciation for clear expectations and accountability measures. My desperate walk to a lawyer's office had become the first step in reclaiming my dignity and securing appropriate treatment. The legal papers filed in my desk drawer represented more than just protection from neglect. They represented proof that dignity and appropriate care were rights, rather than privileges dependent on family goodwill. The formal agreements had created security that allowed authentic relationships to develop, without the resentment and ambiguity that had been destroying our family connections. As evening approached, I prepared dinner in my well-appointed kitchenette, appreciating the efficient appliances and thoughtful storage solutions that accommodated my arthritis limitations. The guest house felt like home in ways it never had during the difficult early years, transformed from a place of exile into a sanctuary where my independence was supported and my needs were respected. The lights in the main house reminded me of the family who lived just yards away, no longer symbols of relationships I was excluded from, but evidence of the complex where multiple generations coexisted respectfully. The formal structure had created space for all of us to succeed in our roles without sacrificing dignity or autonomy. That night, as I settled into my comfortable bed in my secure home, I felt deep satisfaction with the journey I'd traveled from vulnerable, dependent to empowered advocate. The transformation hadn't been easy or comfortable, but it had been necessary and ultimately beneficial for everyone involved. The woman who had been forced to walk to medical appointments in ice storms had successfully negotiated her way into a position of dignity and legal protection. The family member who had been treated as an inconvenient obligation was now recognized as a person with legitimate rights and valued contributions to the household. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as we continued navigating the structured care arrangement, but tonight I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Security in knowing my rights were protected, my needs were legally acknowledged, and my remaining years would be lived on terms that respected my humanity rather than simply managing my existence. The journey had taught valuable lessons about aging, family dynamics, and the importance of legal protection for vulnerable individuals. Love and good intentions weren't sufficient to sustain healthy relationships when care responsibilities were involved. Structure, accountability, and clear communication were essential elements that protected both caregivers and care recipients from the resentments and misunderstandings that could destroy families. My walk to the lawyer's office had been the most important journey of my later years, leading not just to legal protection but to a complete transformation of how my family approached care relationships. The destination had proven worth every difficult step of the path, creating a model for dignified aging that honored both independence and interdependence. The following spring brought an unexpected development that would test the resilience of our carefully constructed care arrangement in ways none of us had anticipated. Marcus received a promotion at his engineering firm that required relocation to their Seattle office, presenting our family with a complex decision about how to maintain our successful care structure across a significant geographic distance. The announcement came during one of our regular evening visits, delivered with the kind of nervous energy that suggested Marcus had been wrestling with the implications for some time before sharing the news. "Mom, I need to discuss something important with you," he began, settling into his usual chair with uncharacteristic fidgeting that immediately put me on alert. "Cheryl and I have been offered an opportunity that could significantly advance my career, but it would require moving to Seattle within the next 6 months. The position comes with substantial salary increase and stock options that could secure our financial future, but obviously it would completely change our current living arrangement." The weight of his words settled over me like a familiar anxiety, reminiscent of the uncertainty I'd felt during the early months of our relationship restructuring. But this time, instead of panic about my future security, I felt a calm determination to approach the challenge systematically using the problem-solving skills I'd developed through our formal care arrangement. "Tell me more about the timeline and logistics," I said, reaching for the notepad I'd learned to keep handy for important family discussions. "What options have you considered for maintaining my care support during this transition?" His relief at my measured response was evident, suggesting he'd been expecting emotional resistance rather than practical planning. "We've been researching several possibilities. Seattle has excellent senior living communities, some of which specifically cater to families who want to maintain close relationships while providing professional care support." Cheryl joined the conversation from the kitchen, where she'd been preparing coffee with the thoughtful attention to my preferences that had become routine since our relationship improvements. "We've also looked into assisted living facilities here in Riverside Heights, so you could maintain your established medical relationships and social connections while we handle the logistics of long-distance care coordination." Their preliminary research demonstrated the kind of proactive planning that our formal arrangement had encouraged, approaching potential problems with systematic analysis rather than emotional reaction. The contrast with how family decisions had been made during the crisis period was remarkable and reassuring. "What's your preference for how we should proceed?" I asked, genuinely curious about their perspective rather than simply accepting whatever solution they proposed. The confidence I'd gained through asserting my rights had transformed me into an active participant in family planning, rather than a passive recipient of decisions made by others. Marcus and Cheryl exchanged glances that suggested they'd discussed this conversation extensively before involving me. "Honestly, Mom, we'd love for you to consider relocating with us," Marcus said. "Seattle has a fantastic healthcare system, and there are assisted living communities that would provide the structure and support you need while allowing us to maintain regular contact." The invitation felt genuine rather than obligatory, representing the kind of family inclusion I'd hoped for when I first moved to their property. But it also raised complex questions about maintaining my independence and the legal protections I'd worked so hard to establish. "I appreciate being included in your planning," I replied. "But this is exactly the kind of major decision that our care contract was designed to help us navigate systematically. I'd like to schedule a consultation with Mr. Thompson to review our options and ensure any transition protects everyone's interests." Their immediate agreement to involve our legal advisor demonstrated how completely they'd embraced the structured approach to family decision-making. The resistance and resentment that had initially characterized their attitude toward formal agreements had evolved into appreciation for clear processes and professional guidance. The consultation with Mr. Thompson 2 weeks later provided clarity about the legal implications of various relocation scenarios and helped us develop a framework for making the decision based on practical considerations rather than emotional pressure. "Mrs. Powell, your current care contract includes provisions for major life changes and relocation scenarios," he explained, reviewing the relevant sections with his characteristic thoroughness. "The key is ensuring that any new arrangement maintains the same standards of care and legal protections you've established here." He outlined 3 primary options: relocating to Seattle with Marcus and Cheryl under a modified care agreement, transitioning to assisted living in Riverside Heights with long-distance family coordination, or exploring independent living options that could provide security while maintaining my autonomy. "Each approach has advantages and challenges," he continued. "Relocation with family maintains close relationships but requires establishing new healthcare providers and legal protections in a different state. Local assisted living provides continuity of medical care, but changes the family dynamic significantly. Independent living maximizes autonomy but may require additional support services as you age." The systematic analysis helped me recognize that this decision represented an opportunity to further refine my approach to aging and care planning, rather than simply a crisis to be managed. The confidence and advocacy skills I'd developed through our legal process had prepared me to evaluate options based on my own priorities, rather than simply accepting whatever arrangement others proposed. Over the following weeks, I conducted my own research into each option, visiting assisted living facilities in the area, researching Seattle's senior services and healthcare systems, and exploring independent living communities that could provide security with maintained autonomy. The investigation process felt empowering rather than overwhelming, demonstrating how much my capacity for self-advocacy had grown. The assisted living facilities in Riverside Heights were impressive, offering comprehensive care services, social activities, and transportation assistance that would eliminate many of the challenges I'd faced during the crisis period. The staff seemed competent and caring, and the residents appeared engaged and well cared for. However, touring these facilities also highlighted how much I valued the independence and privacy I'd fought to establish in the guest house. The shared dining rooms, scheduled activities, and communal living arrangements felt constraining after years of managing my own space and schedule according to my preferences. The research into Seattle options proved surprisingly encouraging. The city's senior services were extensive and well regarded, with assisted living communities that offered graduated care levels allowing residents to age in place as their needs changed. The healthcare system included some of the country's leading geriatric specialists, potentially providing superior medical care to what I'd been receiving. Most intriguingly, Seattle offered independent senior housing communities that combined private apartments with optional support services, allowing residents to maintain autonomy while accessing assistance as needed. These facilities seemed to offer the best of both worlds, independence with security. During my fact-finding process, I also discovered that Washington state had particularly strong elder protection laws and advocacy services, potentially providing even better legal safeguards than what I'd established in our current location. The state's commitment to senior rights and dignity aligned well with the principles I'd fought to establish in my own family relationships. The decision-making process stretched over 2 months, during which our family engaged in more substantive planning conversations than we'd had in years. The formal structure we'd established had created space for honest discussion about preferences, concerns, and long-term goals that might never have occurred under our previous informal arrangements. Marcus and Cheryl proved remarkably supportive of my extended deliberation, providing information and assistance without pressuring me toward any particular choice. Their patience and respect for my decision-making autonomy demonstrated how completely our relationship dynamics had been transformed. "Mom, whatever you decide, we want to make sure you feel secure and supported," Marcus said during one of our planning sessions. "The most important thing is that you're comfortable with the arrangement and confident about your future care." His emphasis on my comfort and confidence, rather than his convenience, represented a fundamental shift from the attitudes that had characterized our early years together. The crisis that had forced us to restructure our relationship had ultimately created space for genuine care and consideration to develop. Cheryl's evolution was equally remarkable. "Opal, I want you to know that you'll always be family regardless of where you choose to live," she said during a particularly meaningful conversation. "I'm grateful for the lessons you taught me about respect and responsibility, and I want to support whatever decision feels right for you." Her acknowledgement of the educational value of our difficult period demonstrated personal growth that extended beyond mere compliance with contractual obligations. The woman who had once treated my needs as inconvenient interruptions had developed genuine appreciation for my dignity and autonomy. The breakthrough in my decision-making came during a video call with a social worker at one of Seattle's premier senior communities. The facility offered independent apartments with graduated support services, allowing residents to maintain privacy and autonomy while accessing assistance as needed. "Mrs. Powell, our community is specifically designed for seniors who value independence but want security about future care needs," the social worker explained. "Residents live in their own apartments with full kitchens and private entrances, but we provide transportation, meal services, housekeeping, and healthcare coordination as requested." The model seemed to address my primary concerns about maintaining autonomy, while ensuring access to appropriate support. More importantly, the facility was located just 15 minutes from Marcus and Cheryl's prospective neighborhood, allowing for regular family contact without the daily intensity of our current arrangement. "What happens if residents' care needs increase significantly?" I asked, remembering the long-term planning provisions in our current care contract. "We have partnerships with assisted living and skilled nursing facilities on campus, so residents can transition to higher care levels without leaving the community or losing their social connections," she replied. "It's designed to support aging in place across the full spectrum of care needs." The comprehensive approach to long-term care planning addressed one of my primary concerns about relocating to an unfamiliar area. Instead of facing future care transitions in isolation, I would be part of a community designed to support successful aging across multiple decades. After discussing the Seattle option with Mr. Thompson and reviewing the legal protections available in Washington state, I made my decision. The opportunity to maintain family relationships while living independently in a community designed for successful aging felt like the natural evolution of the advocacy and self-determination I'd developed through our crisis and recovery period. I've decided to relocate to Seattle with you, I announced during our next family meeting. But I want to establish residence in the Evergreen senior community, rather than recreating our current living arrangement in a new location. Marcus and Cheryl's response exceeded my expectations, with genuine enthusiasm for my choice and immediate offers to assist with the transition planning. Their support felt authentic rather than obligatory, demonstrating how our relationship had matured into mutual respect and consideration. "Mom, I think that's a wonderful decision," Marcus said, his relief and excitement evident. "The facility looks fantastic, and having you nearby while maintaining your independence seems like the perfect balance for all of us." Cheryl's response was equally positive. "Opal, I'm so proud of you for making a choice that prioritizes your own needs and preferences. This feels like the right step for your continued growth and independence." The relocation process unfolded over 4 months, with careful planning that reflected the systematic approach we'd learned to apply to major family decisions. Mr. Thompson coordinated with Washington state attorneys to ensure my legal protections would transfer effectively. Marcus and Cheryl handled logistics while respecting my autonomy in decisions about belongings and apartment setup. Most importantly, we modified our care contract to reflect the new geographic reality while maintaining the core principles of respect, accountability, and clear expectations that had made our arrangement successful. The legal framework would continue providing structure for family relationships while adapting to changed circumstances. The moving day itself felt celebratory rather than traumatic, representing a chosen transition rather than a forced displacement. The guest house that had been transformed from exile to sanctuary was being left for new adventures rather than abandoned in crisis. Carol Benson drove down from Cedar Falls to help with final preparations and say goodbye, her presence providing continuity with my past while supporting my movement toward the future. "Opal, I'm so impressed by how you've taken control of your life and created opportunities for continued growth," she said as we packed the last boxes. "I learned that accepting inadequate treatment wasn't protecting family relationships," I replied. "Sometimes you have to fight for dignity before you can enjoy genuine connection." The Seattle apartment exceeded my expectations, with beautiful views of the city skyline and Mount Rainier, modern appliances and safety features, and a layout that accommodated my mobility needs while providing space for entertaining. The community included a fitness center with senior-appropriate equipment, a library with comfortable reading areas, and social spaces that encouraged interaction without requiring participation. Most importantly, the staff treated residents as autonomous adults rather than patients to be managed, creating an atmosphere of respect and dignity that aligned perfectly with the principles I'd fought to establish in my family relationships. Marcus and Cheryl visited during my first week, helping with final apartment arrangements and exploring the neighborhood together. Their enthusiasm for my new environment felt genuine, and their respect for my space and independence demonstrated how completely our relationship dynamics had evolved. "Mom, this place is fantastic," Marcus said as we toured the community facilities. "You're going to have so many opportunities for activities and social connections, but you can still maintain as much privacy and independence as you want." The balance between security and autonomy that the community provided addressed the core concerns that had driven my original legal action. Instead of being dependent on family goodwill for appropriate care, I now had access to professional support services, while maintaining the dignity and respect I'd fought to establish. Cheryl's response to my new living situation was particularly meaningful. "Opal, seeing you in this environment makes me realize how much you've grown through all the challenges we've faced together. You've become such a strong advocate for yourself, and it's inspiring." Her recognition of my personal growth felt like validation of the difficult journey we'd traveled together. The woman who had once dismissed my needs as inconvenient had developed genuine appreciation for my strength and determination. The first months in Seattle brought new challenges and opportunities that tested my ability to maintain the independence and advocacy skills I'd developed. Establishing relationships with new healthcare providers required assertiveness and clear communication about my needs and expectations. Dr. Sarah Chen, my new primary care physician, proved to be an excellent match for my proactive approach to health management. Mrs. Powell, I appreciate how well prepared you are for our appointments and how clearly you communicate your concerns and questions. It makes providing good care much more effective. The validation from my new medical team reinforced my confidence in the self-advocacy skills I developed through our family crisis and recovery process. The ability to articulate my needs clearly and expect appropriate treatment had become second nature, transforming medical care from a source of anxiety into collaborative health management. The community's transportation services eliminated the stress and uncertainty that had characterized my medical appointments during the difficult period with Cheryl. Professional drivers familiar with healthcare facility logistics ensured I arrived on time and relaxed, able to focus on my health rather than transportation anxiety. Social connections developed gradually through community activities and shared interests. The book club introduced me to other residents who valued intellectual engagement, while the gentle yoga classes provided exercise appropriate for my arthritis limitations. Most importantly, I was building relationships based on mutual interests rather than family obligation. Margaret from my old fitness program visited after I'd been in Seattle for 3 months, curious about how the relocation was affecting my independence and family relationships. Her questions helped me articulate the benefits of my new living arrangement. "Opal, you seem more confident and energetic than I've seen you in years," she observed during our lunch at a nearby restaurant. "How has the move affected your relationship with Marcus and Cheryl?" "It's actually strengthened our connections by removing the daily stress of care coordination," I explained. "We see each other regularly, but as family members who choose to spend time together, rather than people obligated to manage my needs." The distinction felt significant. Our weekly dinners and regular outings had become enjoyable family time rather than duty-driven check-ins. Marcus and Cheryl's visits to my apartment felt like social calls rather than care evaluations, creating space for genuine relationship rather than service provision. The first year in Seattle concluded with a comprehensive review of my care arrangement and living situation, conducted with the same systematic approach that had made our original family contract successful. Mr. Thompson participated via video conference, ensuring continuity of legal guidance across the geographic transition. "Mrs. Powell, how would you assess your quality of life and care support in the new environment?" he asked, consulting notes from our private preparation conversation. "Excellent," I replied without hesitation. "The community provides security and professional support while maintaining my independence and dignity. Family relationships have improved because we're interacting by choice rather than obligation." Marcus and Cheryl's assessment was equally positive. "Mom has thrived in this environment," Marcus reported. "She's more socially engaged, physically active, and emotionally confident than she's been in years." The decision to relocate has benefited everyone involved. The review process confirmed that our systematic approach to family care planning had created sustainable solutions that could adapt to major life changes while maintaining core principles of respect, autonomy, and appropriate support. As my second year in Seattle began, I reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought me from crisis and legal intervention to independence and thriving family relationships. The woman who had been forced to walk to medical appointments in ice storms was now living in a supportive community with professional transportation and comprehensive healthcare coordination. The family member who had been treated as an inconvenient obligation was now enjoyed as a valued relative whose company was sought rather than endured. The crisis that had threatened to destroy our relationships had ultimately created opportunities for growth and improvement that benefited everyone involved. Most importantly, I had discovered that aging didn't require accepting diminished dignity or inadequate care. The legal and advocacy skills I'd developed could be applied to any situation where my rights or needs were threatened, providing security and confidence for whatever challenges lay ahead. The irony remained perfect and instructive. Cheryl's attempts to minimize her caregiving responsibilities had ultimately taught me to demand appropriate treatment from all sources, rather than accepting whatever minimal assistance was offered. The walk to the lawyer's office that had seemed like a desperate measure had become the foundation for a completely transformed approach to aging, family relationships, and personal advocacy. My Seattle apartment, with its beautiful views and professional support services, represented more than just a comfortable place to live. It symbolized the power of refusing to accept inadequate treatment and fighting for the dignity and respect that every person deserves regardless of age or dependence on others. The journey from vulnerable dependent to empowered advocate had been challenging and sometimes painful, but it had created outcomes that exceeded my most optimistic expectations. The legal framework that had initially seemed cold and adversarial had proven to be the foundation for genuine care and authentic relationships. As I prepared for another day in my chosen community, surrounded by friends and family who respected my autonomy while providing appropriate support, I felt profound gratitude for the courage I'd found to demand better treatment. The destination had proven worth every difficult step of the path, creating a model for dignified aging that honored both independence and interdependence. The woman who had once apologized for needing medical transportation now expected reliable assistance as a matter of right. The family member who had once accepted inadequate care to avoid conflict now demanded appropriate treatment as a condition of relationship. The transformation was complete, sustainable, and deeply satisfying. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.